Hello and welcome to the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. This is a podcast aimed at better understanding other people and better understanding ourselves. You can learn more about it at peoplewhoreadpeople.com. If you like the work I do with this podcast, please consider signing up for a premium subscription and consider subscribing to my conflict resolution related Substack newsletter. On this episode, I talk with Yakov Hirsch about the Israel-Palestine conflict, about antisemitism, about empathy, about us versus them mindsets, about the banality of evil, and much more. One of Yakov's goals is to get Jewish people to have more cognitive empathy for Palestinians. He thinks that there's an us versus them Jewish discourse that attempts to make it taboo for Jewish people to have empathy for Palestinians. He has termed this discourse Hasbara culture, and he has written a series of pieces on this topic that can be found on the site Mondo Vice. My decision to talk to Yakov was not related to the recent attack on Israel. We've actually had this talk planned for several weeks. Actually, my own instinct would have been to probably avoid the topic of the Israel-Palestine conflict on this podcast. But I am glad that we had the talk scheduled because I think a lot of people will find Yakov's thoughts interesting. I'll also say that this talk is a sort of follow-up to a talk I had about antisemitism with James Kirchick. I thought Kirchick made a lot of good points, but I also saw that Kirchick would call many things anti-Semitic that I probably wouldn't, especially in the realms of criticisms of Israel. My talk with Kirchick is what prompted Yakov Hirsch to send me his own thoughts and writing, and I figured to balance out the talk I had with Kirchick that I'd invite Yakov on. I want to preface this talk just as I did with the talk with Kirchick. The goal of this podcast is understanding other people's views. And even if you end up disagreeing with some of Yakov's points, hopefully you can see the value in trying to understand why he thinks what he does. Hopefully you can see that Yakov himself is trying to understand people's motivations. That even when he strongly disagrees with people, and even when he thinks they've done something horrible, he's trying to understand why they did those things, and to try to not jump to conclusions about their beliefs and motivations. Yakov's work focuses on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but what we'll talk about in this episode applies to conflicts in general. For example, he and I have talked about the overly paranoid and pessimistic perceptions that many liberals have had of Trump voters, and of Trump himself. And one can see that aspect even as one also may be strongly critical and judgmental of Trump, and even scared of worst-case Trump-related scenarios. In fact, if you're someone who thinks Trump is dangerous, I would argue that it's especially important to try to understand how overly pessimistic and antagonistic views of Trump voters and Trump can be factors in the behavior of Trump and his voters. That's something Yakov and I may talk about in a future episode, because I think Yakov has some interesting thoughts on that. A little bit more about Yakov. He was born into an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family in Brooklyn. He had no real conversations with non-Jewish people until he was in his late teens. He described an environment that instilled with him some paranoia about the non-Jewish outside world. When he was about 20 years old, he left the Jewish environment and got a job for a nonprofit that was called Chess in the Schools, which taught chess to young people. He was a strong chess player, and eventually he was training the chess teachers who worked for that organization. Later, he got into poker. This was in the mid-2000s, during the so-called poker boom, and he was soon playing poker for a living, something he's still doing. He has written many pieces on the Israel-Palestine conflict for outlets including Mondo Vice, Tablet Magazine, and for his own blog on Medium. And he's been on a number of podcasts. You can find him on Twitter at Yakov Hirsch. That's YAKOV-HIRSCH. A few of my own thoughts, very humbly submitted. I look around right now and see so many people seeing the worst in each other. I see so many people seeing motives and beliefs in other people that I just don't think are there. Despite the high intensity of the online fights and heated arguments we're seeing that have been happening around this in the West, I think almost everyone agrees on some basic things in these areas, with the exception of some extreme outliers. I think almost everyone agrees that what Hamas did was horrible and inexcusable, that what happened to Israeli citizens was horrible and continues to be heartbreaking, that it's understandable to question if Israel's decisions in the past or currently have been good or smart, As is the nature of conflict, what's happening is that so many of us are filtering for the worst case interpretations of what the people around us are doing or saying. Some people will filter a show of support for Israel or a show of support for Palestine as indicating a bunch of traits and beliefs that are rarely there. For example, some people will see a show of support for Palestine as an indication of support for Hamas or of a lack of empathy for the Israelis attacked, and some people will see a show of support for Israel as an expression of unilateral support for everything Israel does, or for a lack of empathy for Palestinians. And then you add in the fact that a lot of this debate is happening on social media, where people often speak badly, especially young people. The internet encourages people with no real knowledge of what's going on to sound off on all sorts of topics. And personally, I think the internet is deranging us, something I've talked about in my writings and on this podcast. What's happening around this event is exactly what Yakov and I discuss in this episode, an overly pessimistic filtering for offense and insult and threat. A polarization into us versus them camps, where more and more people have a mindset that you must pick a side. This is the nature of what conflict does to us. Nuance becomes a casualty. On the blog post for this episode, I'll include some links to some pieces I thought were very good regarding the Israel-Palestine situation by some writers whose work on American polarization I highly respect. I'm going to start the interview a few minutes into our talk when Yakov is talking about how his politics changed over time. Okay, here's the talk.
So now let me describe my politics. When I left Orthodoxy, I got interested in neoconservatism. I was reading Commentary magazine all the time. I remember someone asked me who my favorite politician was, probably about 1990, and I'd say, oh, it's Netanyahu. He made American Jews proud. So handsome, speaks English so well. Just there's the word naches. You just feel pride in this guy Netanyahu that all the non-Jews are looking at him. This is not the way everyone looks at it, but this is the way I did, and a lot of people do. Right? That's what Netanyahu was. So, and he's a big part of our story. Then 2 books came out, and historians started to fight about these books, about antisemitism and the Holocaust, and I really got interested in this fight. And from this fight, my argument is, I wrote an article for Tablet, Hasbara Culture and the Curse of Bibiism, and in that article I said, our world today is a product of that fight between these 2 historians.
Okay.
So I saw that fight, and over the years, I'm seeing the result of the who won and lost that fight play out in the real world. So in 2016, I was playing poker all the time. I was in the casino, the Commerce Casino, and I see on the screen, like 5 a.m. or something, there's like a video from a BBC, and it shows an Israeli soldier shooting a Palestinian who was lying on the ground, executing a Palestinian. So there was a video that came out that showed what had happened was was in Hebron in the West Bank. A Palestinian stabbed an Israeli soldier who was hardly even injured. The guy was shot, the Palestinian was shot. He's on the ground. And 10 minutes later, a Jeep comes up with another soldier. This soldier comes out. It turns out that the guy who was stabbed was his friend. He walks over towards where the Palestinian attacker is laying. He takes his rifle out and he shoots him in the head. Okay? And we have this on video. When I saw this was a very big deal. I just left the game and went home. This is such an important story. Because now we will see the difference between Hasbara, which means explaining or maybe public relations, and Hasbara culture, which was what
you coined that.
What I'm talking about.
And you coined that term before that, right? That was something you...
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Now, what's very interesting is how the public and politicians react to this event, right? Because it's clear the army, they arrested him on the spot. Whether you're right wing or left wing, you can't have a soldier, who got into a fight with his girlfriend in the morning, goes to work, he sees a Palestinian, he just shoots a Palestinian, right? No matter what you think, the Israeli army, the IDF, cannot have their soldiers executing a Palestinian when they feel like it, right? Any army. So they arrested him on the spot. And now what happened next is where the story starts. Because what would Hasbara be? Hasbara would be some Israeli official coming on TV, or let's say a representative of the ADL, or these Jewish organizations, these quote pro-Israel, they would say, "Oh, this guy Elor Azaria, who executed this guy, he just came out of the mental institution 2 days ago. He's crazy." Right? They would explain that what you saw is not representative of the Israeli army. This is an exception, right? That's what Hasbara would be. So they would tell the audience, don't make too much of what you saw. This guy's a rotten apple. That's what Hasbara would be. And you see that all the time in the discourse, all this explaining. When Israel does something bad, you'll just see everyone explaining why it's not so bad, right? That's Hasbara. This is Hasbara culture. What happened next? Netanyahu supported the soldier. He basically said, "We are good. We are Jews. There are the anti-Semites, and we can't put a Jew in jail for killing a Palestinian." So while this guy's in jail, the politicians are saying this guy's a hero. What do you have him in jail for, right? So the right wing in Israel, the Elor Azaria affair, very big deal. This event, because think about what it means that half the country says, "Yeah, of course he should go in jail. You can execute someone like that," and the other half says, "He's protecting the Jews." Right? You're going to put him in jail? Don't you understand why we should kill this guy? Like, think about what's happening now. Elor Azaria is telling his friends, "Oh, look, you see? Aren't you happy I killed that guy? If I wouldn't have killed him, he'd be back, invading us," right? That's that perspective. The bottom line is all the politicians, instead of saying that Elor Azaria is a rotten apple, basically became a hero for this execution, right? So now look what happens next in the story. When I write my heroes, it's not Israel against Palestinians. In my Hasbara culture writing, I'm making a hero out of an Israeli deputy chief of staff, a soldier, right, who's killed a lot of Palestinians probably, right? But I'm just telling the world, I'm telling the story, and I'm telling you, look what you're seeing here. So on the Holocaust Day, they have a day, something called the Holocaust Day, and this guy gave a speech, and he said in this speech in 2016, in March, or April, he said, I'm noticing processes that are taking place in this country that are similar to what took place in Europe 80 or 90 years ago. So this is what he said. He's basically saying what I'm seeing in this country, all this defense for Azaria, right? Don't you understand, all you people? He's a murderer, right? And so he's saying, I'm noticing that the culture, our political culture, is like it was in Germany in the 1930s. Okay? Think about that. Think about someone in the Holocaust Day saying that. Yair Golan is his name. He actually, in the events of last week, the Israeli soldiers, they were not organized, and the army wasn't around. He went. He's now a big hero because he went. He just took his car and he drove down south, and he just risked his life really to help people, to try to save people. Right, in the real world, right? He's a hero. Right. Forget about what's happening. We see he's a hero from just last week. So now the reaction to him saying that was terrible. The right wing, they said he should be fired, and he was a favorite to be actually the next chief of staff. But when he gave that speech, it was over, and he knew it was over when he gave the speech. To him, this was more important than the speech. But the country, everyone was attacking him because, you're comparing us to what happened. How could you say such a thing?
So I'm going to try to summarize my understanding of Hasbara culture. Basically, you think that there are some pro-Israel people who are basically overly paranoid and about the subject of anti-Semitism, that they too often filter for the worst case, most pessimistic interpretations of the people and criticisms, the criticisms that they face. And they too often call those things anti-Semitism and things like this. Is that a pretty fair summation
yes,
of the state?
Right, but the key point to what you're saying, what does it mean when somebody is an anti-Semite? You just said, yeah, we call people anti-Semites too frequently. The question is, when someone calls someone else, when quote, the Jews believe somebody's an anti-Semite, what does that mean? What do they believe about the person? This is the biggest question, because in Israel right now, they are looking, they see what Hamas did, and now they're looking and they're saying, what's the meaning of what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we throw around anti-Semitic allegations, it's not just a word to Hasbara culture. It's not just a word. It means this person is something, is thinking something, is something. It's very important what these anti-Semitic fights, because when a Jew believes someone's an anti-Semite, as I'm going to show you, it means that this person really wants to kill the Jews. That's the important thing. Therefore, these things are very important. These anti-Semitic allegations.
So maybe that's a good segue into talking about the books that you were going to talk about.
Yes. So in, I think it was 1990, a historian called Christopher Browning wrote a book called Ordinary Men. In this book, he, quote, discovered that there were Germans, this German battalion, Police Battalion 101, that killed Jews, and they didn't do it because they hated Jews so much. They didn't kill the Jews because, you know what, they told the Jew, I need to kill this guy. They did it because they didn't want to look bad in front of their friends. They were, all the reasons, right? Of course, anti-Semitism was part of it, right? But the killing, it wasn't because of Jew hatred. This killing had other reasons, right? That's what the discovery, he said. That these people important to say, they weren't ideological Nazis. They were middle-aged policemen who were already adults when the Nazis came to power, right?
So it was more about peer pressure,
right?
And
so it's all these things, and it wasn't. Now, so the reaction to this historian's book was a different book by Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. I don't know if he even had a PhD yet, but maybe he had a PhD, or maybe this was his PhD thesis. And he said in this book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Okay, that's the title. So he said, no, Christopher Browning, you are wrong. The reason why these people killed the Jews, right, even the police battalion, is because there's something about the Germans that for centuries they've been building this anti-Semitism, right? And this culminated in the Holocaust. So this Holocaust, these people killing, is because this eliminationist anti-Semitism, that it's sort of like a disease. That's how you have to think about it. That these people
like a true kind of evil, abiding hatred, deeply
right.
embedded.
Hatred, real hatred enough. I need to kill this person. I hate them so much. So this book caused an uproar. He went around the whole world. Germany, he was a celebrity, he was a bestseller. While this was going on, and while his books were selling out among Jews and everybody else, right? Imagine how popular a book is. A lot of Germans, that's why they fucking kill the Jews, right? Because there's special eliminationist anti-Semitism. So, but historians, right, had to deal with this book, and to them, this book was the biggest joke in the world. This wasn't a serious book. When you read about the reaction of the historians, which I quote in my article, they didn't know what to do. They said the public is getting this false information that we know is not true, right? They destroyed Goldhagen, all his arguments, all his proofs. So I quote this, this Holocaust historian saying he doesn't know how we're going to recover almost from these ideas getting out into the world. It takes forever to establish the truth of an event before it gets down to the people, right? But now this false idea about this, quote, eliminationist anti-Semitism, which is not true, is now everyone believes it. Everyone loves this book.
This is related to the Hannah Arendt's theory of the banality of evil. Yes. Were they putting it in that context then, like talking about these books in the context of
exactly. That? Let me use that to really explain what this fight is about. Okay, so Israel kidnapped, if you want to use that word, Adolf Eichmann, 1960-61, from Argentina. They discovered him. They were searching for him. They discovered him. They brought him back to Israel, and they put him on trial. And this Hannah Arendt was a German intellectual who escaped Nazi Germany. She went to the trial for the New Yorker magazine, and she wrote a series on the Eichmann trial. So she was sent back every couple of weeks. This is the latest from the Eichmann trial. That became the book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a very, very important book, really, as we'll see in this story. She said a lot of things, but I'm going to tell you the most important thing that she said, okay? And I'm quoting Corey Robin And this is a piece called The Trials of Hannah Arendt in the Nation magazine. He says, for Arendt, the question was not whether Eichmann was an anti-Semite, nor did she doubt the anti-Semitic character of the Holocaust. The question Arendt posed in Eichmann was whether Eichmann's contribution to the genocide of the Jews was motivated, could be accounted for by his fanaticism, his boundless hatred of Jews. That's the question. Was 6 million Jews killed because how much? Because of the hatred? Right? Every person who killed every Jew. And we're using Eichmann as an example. So she's saying no. He might have been an anti-Semite, but him doing his job to kill millions of Jews was not motivated by Jew hatred. That was her insight, which was an earthquake, right? Think about it from people who are still alive, recovering, survivors. Think about what the Jewish community after the Holocaust, and now they're told, right? And think about the intellectuals, the Jewish intellectuals being told, you know what? The Holocaust, it wasn't even about the Jews. I mean, I'm exaggerating the point, right?
But, it was a very upsetting idea, and it was very controversial, right? Like people were arguing a lot about that at the time.
Right. So just our story is to have cognitive empathy, to try to see the world from different perspectives, right? When people reacted, you have to understand it's how natural it is to react, right? Mm-hmm. When Hannah Arendt says this, right? So that was the fight. Now it turns out...
And real quickly, I think the point is that when something really horrible like this happens and people do horrible things, the idea that there was something banal about their horrible actions is in effect humanizing them, which is threatening to people, that
right.
There can be a desire to see them as something inhuman, something separate.
Yeah, just as an aside, right? So think about the fights, the America's wars, right? The language is the politics is Manichaean, right? That means either you're with us or against us. Are you with, Saddam represents evil, or Putin or whoever, right, represents evil, we represent good. And therefore we have to do this foreign policy, right? That's the Manichaean. This is neoconservatism. This idea, this Manichaean idea that we're fighting a fight between good versus bad is similar to this idea about Eichmann, right? Therefore, you can't show any nuance, right? You try to discuss whatever the politics are, whatever the question, whatever the foreign policy, the argument, right, being made that we're good versus evil is extremely difficult to deal, in a debate, right? Because as soon as it sounds like you're defending Saddam, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Hannah Arendt. So now I was going to say in 2010, this new book came out that actually there's transcripts of Eichmann in Argentina where he was ideological, right? This is when he's saying stuff about the Jews. He's with old comrades, right? So they have these things, and the argument is, listen, he is ideological. Now, it doesn't mean that he killed all those Jews for this, but that's the argument, right? Hannah Arendt might say, maybe she'd say, well, he was with his friends, this is the way he talks, or even if he talks, yeah, whatever, he doesn't mean it enough that he's about to kill every Jew he sees. Right, that's how Arendt might respond to this new quote evidence.
Or even theoretically, if she was wrong about Eichmann, her point could still stand. It could still be a valid point, like even if somebody might disagree about Eichmann specifically, right?
Okay, so now just to summarize, I'm going to quote from Peter Novick in The Holocaust in American Lives, and he said, quote, "In the long run, almost all scholars have come to accept Arendt's thesis that the typical Holocaust perpetrator was, quote, terrifyingly normal, and by no means a driven anti-Semite. Yehuda Bauer, an Israeli Holocaust historian, writes, the Germans did not have to hate the Jews in order to kill them. One suspects that had they received instructions to murder all the Poles or all the Frenchmen, they would have performed equally well. For this reason, among others, scholars of the Holocaust have rejected the argument of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen that generations of systematic socialization into murderous hatred of Jews was a necessary condition for the Holocaust." Okay? So we come to the end of the fight between Browning and Goldhagen. So how did this fight affect reality, affect our world? So Goldhagen wrote another few books, okay? Basically, he used this idea of eliminationist anti-Semitism. He wrote a book about the Catholics. He said they're eliminationist anti-Semitism, basically. And the last book he wrote, we're going to jump to, which was in 2013. So this guy, Goldhagen, who defeated historians about the meaning of the Holocaust, of the meaning of these people killing the Jews, right? So what's he up to, right? Everyone knows, for the world, he's a famous historian, world's biggest expert on anti-Semitism, world's biggest expert on the Holocaust. That's how he's viewed by a lot of the public. So the latest book he wrote was The Devil That Never Dies, The Rise and Threat of Global Anti-Semitism. Okay? This book reviewed everywhere. And of course, Jews who are concerned about anti-Semitism, right? When they're at Barnes and Noble, this book jumps out at them and they read this, right? This creates culture, right? The arguments he makes in this book are what people talk about at the Shabbos table, right? When you have an argument, you use what Goldhagen said in this book. Now, so I'm going to quote to you from a review of this book by the Wall Street Journal, which is pretty conservative. And the person who reviewed this book, Anthony Julius, is a very respected lawyer and very knowledgeable about the Holocaust. So they got him to make this review. Wow, Anthony Julius reviewing this book. And let me read you the beginning of this review. I have written this review with reluctance, that there should be strife within the party to which Mr. Goldhagen and I both belong. The party of anti-Semites will only give satisfaction to the haters. But we must be smart, truth-telling participants in this terrible struggle. We must be intelligent in our judgments, reliable in the claims we make. And for sure, while we must not minimize dangers, we shouldn't overstate them either. The Devil That Never Dies doesn't contribute to our existing understanding of anti-Semitism. It doesn't give anti-Semites fresh, good argument. Indeed, it is so easily and justly dismissible, it weakens the very cause its authors seek to promote. Could you imagine, getting a request to review this book in the Wall Street Journal, and you review, okay, you really don't like the book, but somehow you'll just, you'll get by without doing this. Think about how bad this book was, that he said, I don't care about my reputation. I don't care. A lot of people will think I'm stabbing, whatever. I have to say this. This is terrible, this influence that this book will have. And he, like he says, he's not against, in other words, he's also, quote, Hasbara culture. He's sympathetic to Goldhagen's view of anti-Semitism, right? When he says I'm an anti-Semite, that's what it means in the real world. Your idea about there's a lot of anti-Semitism, et cetera, I agree with you. But this book, I'm going to quote something that Goldhagen wrote in this book about Israel. So this whole book, which is now, there have been 50 books written similar to this book since this book, right? This is very popular now that Jewish writers are writing books about anti-Semitism. Every different way of looking how today is exactly like 1939 and we're about to be gassed. This is what Hasbara culture is. This eliminationist anti-Semitism is everywhere. That's what this guy Goldhagen, who wrote that book, that was everyone believes. Suddenly, this is what he's telling the Jews, basically, right? This is what he's telling. So just to give you a sense, when this anti-Semitism thing is thrown around, this is what we're saying. This is who they are, because anti-Semitism, according to Hasbara culture, is one thing. All anti-Semitism is 1,000 years ago. It's all the same thing, right? And when you take a position that's against, quote, the Jews, these people look, that's whose side you're on, right?
Well, it's like saying, if you can't call out this clear evil, then, that this obvious dark force, then you are clearly, morally bankrupt, basically.
Yes, and you believe things about the Jews. This is very important. Anti-Semitism is believing certain things about the Jews, right? You believe they control the world. You believe whatever it is. The Jews, this or that, right? When Ilhan Omer is called an anti-Semite, right? The accusation is she's thinking about the Jews all the time. That's what it means. So to that woman, you know what she does at night? She thinks about how to get the Jews. This is what it means when someone becomes an anti-Semite. It's an obsession. It's a medieval incubus. That's the way to understand this. What Goldhagen said about the Germans. It's a medieval incubus. That's what anti-Semites have. A medieval incubus. They got a disease that they caught. When you look at the Jews, this is what you think about that. So, of course, a lot of this book is about everyone being, anti-Israel, and that means they want to kill the Jews. Basically, that's what he's saying. So, look how far he goes. Look at this argument. Anyone who claims that the antipathy of the region or of the world at large is only for Israel because of its policies and not towards Jews in general because of their Jewness, or who claims that such people's intent is anything but eliminationist towards Israel, the country, and towards Jews in general because of their Jewness, is being duped or is seeking to dupe others. And there you have it. All these people are now, they're screaming on Twitter with like taking the side of the Palestinians. It's not because is what Israel is doing. Okay, it's not because Israel policies. It's not because what they do. It's because these people, right? These people, either they have this hatred of the Jews, or they've been duped to believe what they believe about Israel. Just to give you a quote by Yair Rosenberg, who just wrote this article about Hamas. He represents what I write. I'm just talking about ideas. When I mention people, I'm not judging them or anything. I'm talking about the ideas that they espouse, right? They could be the most wonderful people in the world. I don't know. I don't know them. I'm just talking about how their ideals operate in the world. So this is a quote. He wrote now an article in Atlantic, very influential Atlantic, when they talk about anti-Semitism and the Jews at Hamas. So he just wrote this big article. Of course, this article is important for what it does to the culture. But anyway, this is a tweet. There's been a lot of deserved criticism of college students celebrating Jewish death in the guise of supporting the Palestinian cause. But as this piece rightly notes, while it's easy to blame the students, what does their conduct say about their teachers? So when Hasbara culture sees these people demonstrating, pro-Palestinian people around the world, what they see is these people, like he said, hating the Jews. All this is not because of anything Israel did or any objective analysis. They want to destroy Israel. Like Goldhagen said, eliminationist. All these people demonstrating, it's not about the Palestinians, it's about Israel, and it's eliminationist. They want to kill the Jews, all these people. So, Barry Weiss, there was this professor, this tweet going around by Cornell, talking about how happy he was by what what Hamas did. So he says, I forget the words he used, but I'm energized, right? I'm energized.
Exhilarated or something.
Exhilarated. Right? So what's he saying? So let's imagine being Kim. What is he saying? He's saying, he's giving you the Palestinian perspective, the Hamas perspective, okay? These people have been locked up, open their prison. Israel does whatever it wants. This is going to go on for the next 1,000 years as there's nothing the Palestinians can do about it. The whole world is against them. They shoot these rockets. It's just, it's totally the Palestinian perspective. They're locked in this jail. And these people believe in decolonization. Israel is this European export into the Middle East. That's what the Zionist project is. And of course, we're going to be happy when they fight back. It's like rooting for the Indians when America, in the 18th century, America, moving across the country, right? Settling across the country. And when Indians came across or found whites, men, women, whatever, it was brutal, right? It was like what Hamas did to the quote Americans, right? We're not judging, right? We're trying to act, when we talk about these things, we're trying to be political scientists. That means I cried and cried. I have a sister who lives in Jerusalem, I told you, and just,
I think that's an important point. It's like, because I think what you're arguing for is like trying to understand what people are thinking. Like, so for example, that Cornell professor, like I found what he said really gross and I judged him for that. But I can also, like you're saying, try to understand what he's thinking and the best versions of it. And it's like, I can criticize him while also trying to understand what he's thinking and what's driving some of these.
What we want is, like, if we were to ask him, hey, what do you mean? Right? What he tells us, that's what we're reporting to the world. You see what is the speech? This is what he means by the speech. Then we can make judgments or not. But we need to know reality. Now, if you look at Barry Weiss, who I've written a few articles about.
And real quick, I'll throw in there too. I think a lot of people are taking the most extreme things, people say, like that Cornell professor, for example,
Yes.
and kind of extrapolating it to everyone who's doing much more subtle things of
Yes.
just saying, let's support
Right.
Palestine, or, criticizing Israel. And so they're taking the most easy to criticize and judge
Right.
behaviors and saying, that's what this guy's language represents what other people are saying, basically, which I think is part of the very nature of conflict too. We see these kind of extreme things and say that language represents what other people are thinking too.
We are in an incredible, dangerous time. What we saw happening, last Saturday, you have to understand this. Every Jew is brought up with what happened in the Holocaust. The Einsatzgruppen and these SS units hunting Jews everywhere. This is, when we think about, that's what happened. And people think, well, now at least we have Israel, right? What's Israel? A refuge. If this happens anywhere around the world, we can always go to Israel if things get bad, right? And Israel, prides itself about the most sophisticated, army in the world, selling all their ideas and weapons everywhere. And then what happens? The Hamas gets in, and the scenes are Israel couldn't protect. Netanyahu, the protector of the Jews, can't protect his own citizens, right? He's talking always about the whole world, his own citizens. So these things, the emotion,
that's terrifying.
That it brings out in people and Jews in Israel and everywhere else for a whole bunch of reasons, is overwhelming. It's so overwhelming, which every Jew with any connection, no matter what his politics is, right? Which is why there's a problem in the left. When we're interpreting things differently, right? If every event, think about what's happening, every event is interpreted by Hasbara culture as they're doing this, they're thinking about the images of the Jews that were killed, right? That's what these people are thinking when they're demonstrating. Whereas in the real world, those people think they saw it, they don't want to look about it. Why would they rather look at? They'd rather look at all the dead bodies, and they don't rather look, but that's compelling to them, right? So this is what almost everyone, or most of these people, that's what they're demonstrating against. The killing of innocent people. But when Hasbara culture looks at it, when Barry Weiss, what she said, this guy, what did she say? What did she describe what was happening here? This guy's exhilarated by the killing of Jews. That's what she said. This professor is exhilarated by the killing of Jews. Now, that's not true. It could be. He might very well, but that's not most likely, right? If we ask him, he wouldn't talk about the Jews, right?
It reminds me of a similar thing to what somebody said. Somebody had some quote about 9/11 that was also similarly criticized, where they basically said something about something like the brave terrorists or something had a lot of bravery or some similar word that got a lot of criticism, but the person was just trying to communicate something like, well,
right,
they clearly were brave no matter what you thought of them, or some kind of debate around that, where it was a similar thing where it's like, I would not have used that word, but I kind of understand what you were trying to communicate. But a quick note here, I realized what I was thinking about was something Bill Maher said on his show Politically Incorrect not long after 9/11. He was responding to people like George W. Bush calling the 9/11 terrorists cowards. Bill Maher said, "We have been the cowards lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away. That's cowardly. Staying in the airplane when it hits the building, say what you want about it, that's not cowardly." And the writer Susan Sontag said something similar. These things, as you'd expect, kicked off some outrage and heated debate. Okay, back to the talk. Yeah, I do think, to your point, it's something I think is such a basic aspect of all human conflict, where the conflict can be so complex, like especially for something that goes back many years and has all these, twists and turns, and you can examine it all different ways. And then and there's so many ways to filter all of that information in many ways, which to me gets at the basic point of it's just so easy for humans to disagree on complex topics, which plays into how we disagree on all sorts of issues, and a conflict is a complex issue, right? So it makes sense that people can filter for all sorts of interpretations, and also to your point too, it's like the complexity of even what's happening right this second. It's like some people will be focused on one thing, and then other people will be focused on what's happening like right now, like the Israel's response is happening right now, as opposed to something that was in the past, no matter how horrific it is. So I think there's all these different ways that this complex prism of how people can parse, and then you add in the complexity of like how people speak about these things is not nuanced sometimes, and they speak badly, they speak in just plain stupid, or
Yes.
even ways we think are very wrong. So you add in all this complexity, and then everyone's reacting to how people are speaking, and they're filtering it through their lens, and it's just such a complex thing.
Right. That's why it's so important to get this right. It's so important that the people, they need to, there's so much noise. This is all noise. We have to really get to some truth.
It is
So,
important. It's theoretically, humanity ending problem, right? If we can't, especially with all the noise that social media and the internet helps create, it's, to me, it's just like an amplifier of the things we've been dealing with in humanity for all of history. It's basically creating this kind of like a nuclear reaction, reaching critical mass kind of thing, of amplifying all the reactions that people have against each other, right? So to me, it's this is a very fundamental thing, that if humanity can't solve our fundamental ways that we always fight with each other, we really, I don't think we're going to be around much longer. That's my own take. But
and this is a danger, like Hezbollah. This is which a very powerful force in Lebanon. There are things that Israel, I believe, that if Israel keeps on doing the things it's been doing, there's a point in which Hezbollah will have to like go to war with Israel. I don't know what that point is, right? But Hezbollah, this resistance, the organization, at some point the Arab world would look at them. What's your reason for being? If you don't hit Israel now, what's the point of Hezbollah, right? So I don't know where that is, but this is where we're heading very fast. Okay, so now we're going to continue in our story. Last we heard was Goldhagen saying that all this hatred towards Israel has nothing to do with Israel's policies. It's because of these people's Jewish, because Israel's the Jewish country. Anyone who claims what I'm saying is not true is being duped, or seeking to dupe others. This is all about the Jews, right? It's the same thing. It's the same as the Holocaust, the same as 1,000 years ago. It's the same thing that we're up against. That's what he's telling the reader. And what I am telling you and your audience is that this became true, right? This is the culture right now, right? So we have to think, when people read something, what would happen if they believe what they're reading? And I'm telling you that people believe what they're reading. Just think about this. There's been 50 books the last couple of years, about Jewish victimhood, but everyone wants to kill the Jews. Okay, so now let me give you the non-Hasbara culture perspective. This is J.J. Goldberg, who reviewed this Goldhagen book in Democracy magazine. So I'm quoting from this review. He says, there have been dozens of assaults on Jews and Jewish targets around the world by Muslim attackers, usually in explicit retaliation for Israeli actions. Some have been lone wolf attacks, including deadly shootings on the Brooklyn Bridge in 1994, atop the Empire State Building in 1997, at Los Angeles International Airport in 2002, and at a Seattle Jewish charity in 2006. Others have been planned by attacks by terrorist organizations, like the murderous assault on a Mumbai synagogue in 2008, or the deadly bombings of a Tunisian synagogue in 2002, two Istanbul synagogues in 2003, and the Jewish restaurant, community center, and cemetery in Casablanca in 2003. And this doesn't include dozens of attacks that were non-fatal or were foiled by authority. In one sense, this constitutes a new wave of violent anti-Semitism, as Goldhagen and others claim. It is a series of attacks on Jews who have not done anything to invite it, because they are Jews. In another sense, though, it is an ugly expansion of a centuries-old territorial war that hasn't hesitated to target civilians on both sides, and now includes their supporters, allies, and kin around the world. Israel's intelligence professionals believe the war can be ended through compromise, but will only get uglier until that happens. Zealots believe they have a God-given mandate to stand firm, and they're holding Jews around the world hostage to their belief. and recruiting unsophisticated polemics like Daniel Goldhagen to make the case. He's saying Israel's a country. Let's make believe it's not a Jewish country. Let's make believe it's the Irish country, right? It's a different country. If they would do what Israel did, if they would go in the the Nakba, to take the whole story, but they're not the Jews, right? It's the Irish. I'm quoting the sociologist who made this point. If, let's say, Israel was the Irish, the home of the Irish people, and there was some terrorist attack, and the Irish prime minister would say, they killed us only because we were Irish. Only because it's the only reason they killed. That's the discourse on Israel. They killed us only because we were Jews. So he's saying, no, you're having a fight with another two nationalisms are fighting. Look in the real world. It's, quote, understandable. This is not the same Jew hatred about Jews going to the last 1,000 years.
Can I dig in there a little bit? Because when I interviewed James Kirchick, one thing he said when I asked him about how he separated or defined anti-Semitism in terms of criticism of Israel, he talked about his view that our people being imbalanced in how they criticize Israel, and his view was that people aimed far too much criticism at Israel that they wouldn't aim at other countries who had done the same. And I'm curious, how do you see that? Because I can see reasons why we talk about Israel more than other countries in the West, basically. But I'm curious to get your take on that.
Okay, so my writing on Hasbara culture, I look at these arguments that certain Jewish journalists make. I should call them Hasbara culture journalists because this is not a Jewish thing. This is a victimhood thing. I'll call them the Hasbara culture journalists, which Kirchick is one. The arguments they make, and I unpack it and I think about it. I have cognitive empathy for Kirchick. And then I'm saying, look what Kirchick believes. That's what my writing does. I said, read what he wrote. This is what he means. This is what he believes, right? That's what my articles basically are. How would a social scientist answer this question? What's going on with these people? If they could, they would interview every person demonstrating in some pro-Palestinian march, right, somewhere, right? And they'd pull them in and they'd have three experts, three guys with 12 PhDs, and they'd start asking this person question. Hey, when's the first time you heard about Palestine? And the person would answer. And when they hear the story, what led this person to this march? And what does she believe about the world? If they were to do it with every person in that march, they could then give an analysis and say, the meaning, what is the meaning of this march? So what Kirchick does is he's taking one of these people who are, quote, pro-Palestinian, right? And say, let's analyze what they're saying. They made this argument, hold on, but they make the same argument with China? Think about how human beings actually operate. If you take a person, it'll be like some people have the story. Yeah, my brother's girlfriend was a Palestinian. I never thought about the Palestinians people, but somebody she's saying stories, etc. That's one way. Another person is an Arab, whatever. So all that's the real world. And these people, there's always reasons why you're interested. It's like going over to someone worried about climate change and say, hey, why aren't you worried about the what's going on in Israel? Don't you think this is more important than climate change, which is 1,000 years? Shouldn't you be more concerned? So any person, you could question them and see they're not intellectual, they're not consistent, right? That's not the way the world works. A person, for whatever it is, he feels this bothers him more than other things, which to Kirchick, that means, it's about the Jews, right? You come up with all these arguments to see if these people are anti-Semites, right? All these IHRA definition of anti-Semitic, when all you need to do is go talk to them.
I was going to say, I don't know if you're going to get to this, but the thing that struck me in there is the fact that there's a lot of violence over there itself means that Israel's more in the news and people talk about it more, and the fact that it gets support from America means it gets more attention. So I just think there's various reasons that it's more in the news, right?
Sure, and everyone is so certain of their position that if you're any group you're part of, someone say, hey, what's your position on Israel-Palestine? Well, you better get a position, right? Whose side are you on, right? That's the way, it's almost like you almost have to have a position on this issue.
Right. It's just discussed so much more, from, it's kind of a cascade of things too. It's, the violence itself gets attention, and then the fact that it is a very important topic to many people that just becomes more important to more and more people. So yeah, that's just to say, I didn't find that argument very persuasive.
This is where we are. We have an argument by J.J. Goldberg saying that Israel is a country like any other country. They're doing bad things in the world with the people. People react the way they do, a lot of different ways, right? And that's what this is about. It's about anyone else would be there instead of the Palestinians. You'd see some version of the events taking place, right? Maybe slightly different, whatever. Basically, this has to happen. In fact, Israeli security people have been telling the politicians. There's a documentary called The Gatekeepers, 2011, where former Israeli heads of the Mossad, the last 5 heads of the Mossad, basically a warning about what's happening now. This is going to happen unless you deal with the Palestinian situation. Netanyahu's a big genius. He managed to get around the Palestinians. That's he's so proud of. I can make deals and the whole world doesn't care about the Palestinians. That is his accomplishment. Anyway, but the point I want to make, so the argument either whether this is about all these anti-Israel people, it's about the Jews, or it's about a country doing what the country is doing. Now, the next thing I'm going to read to you is this, what we're seeing now all over the world, these demonstrations against Israel, right? These took place every time Israel has attacked Gaza in the last, 15 years. It's been like 5 times. So after one of those times, Operation Protective Edge in September 2014, this is Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic. This is the article. Does Human Rights Watch understand the nature of prejudice? A powerful advocate appears to believe that anti-Semitism is sparked in turn by Jewish behavior. September 21st, 2014. A few days ago, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, tweeted the following statement. Germans rally against anti-Semitism that flared in Europe in response to Israel's conduct in Gaza war. Merkel joins. What happened was there was anti-Semitism after the last Israeli attack on Gaza. So the Germans had a rally to defend the Jews. So Germans rally against anti-Semitism that flared in Europe in response to Israel's conduct in Gaza war, right? So he wrote this op-ed about this rally, right? Because these people were saying, don't blame the Jews on Israel, etc., whatever they're saying. So this is Goldberg's analysis, okay? Roth's framing of this issue is very odd and obtuse. Anti-Semitism in Europe did not flare, quote, in response to Israel's conduct in Gaza or anywhere else. Anti-Semitic violence and invective are not responses to events in the Middle East, just as anti-Semitism does not erupt, quote, in response to policies of banks owned by Jews or in response to editorial positions taken by the New York Times. This is for the simple reason that Jews do not cause anti-Semitism. What is Goldberg saying here? This is basically what he's saying. Since Israel, according to Goldberg, Israel is the Jewish state, and the fact that it's the Jewish state, this attracts a response from people. That's the Jewish state, right? They don't look at Israel, it's the Jewish state. So when this Jewish state behaves in the world, and people demonstrate against it, it's not because it's Israel's doing something, it's because it's the Jewish state. Right? So he's saying, you head of Human Rights Watch, you're saying that anti-Semitism was about Israeli behavior, right? He's saying, no, anti-Semitism is not about Israeli behavior, right? Just to give you that Yair Rosenberg tweet that I told you earlier, there has been a lot of deserved criticism of college students celebrating Jewish death in the guise of supporting the Palestinian cause, right?
Right. I think that this gets at, what you're getting at is this mind reading aspect of conflict, which I think is a fundamental dynamic in conflict, where we overly mind read. We think that we know what's in the hearts and minds of the people on the other side, the people who are aligned against us. I mean, we see this a lot in the American conflict, the divides here, where you'll see, people on the left, people on the right, write these elaborate pieces about they know what's in the hearts and minds of their political opponents. That it's just a lot of mind reading and making suppositions that are not based on any logic. You usually can't figure out exactly why people are doing what they're doing, especially in a conflict situation. So I think you're getting at this mind reading thing, and also getting at the aspect of that I think is a fundamental nature of extreme conflict too, where people do not want to be blamed for their role. They don't want to be criticized and seen as contributing to a conflict. And the thing that comes to mind for me is there, in the left in America, there's a lot of pushback to the idea that some liberals contribute toward divides, even though, you've got entire books written by politically liberal people about the contributions to our divides on the liberal side. So, but there's this allergy to self-examination and this instinct to say, no, you cannot examine our role in this. You are casting blame at the wrong side. Yeah, I think there's this real allergy there to, and it sets up just a logical impossibility of basically saying you can't examine anything that we've done or criticize anything that we've done, and to do so is to make a false moral equivalence, right? And that's what a lot of people in any conflict will do. They'll say you are making a false moral equivalence even by trying to examine our role in this conflict, or this role in whatever violence.
Yes, agree. What I'm saying is, what genocide experts do, when they looked at the behavior of these soldiers who killed the Jews, the police battalion 101, what they want is to know what the person is thinking as they shot the Jews, right? That's what they're after. We want to get into his head to understand what was he thinking, so that we should know, we should prepare for the next time this happens, when we see people thinking like that, right? That's the goal, right?
You really want to understand it so you can prevent it.
Yeah,
you want to understand it.
And it's important, but not judging. If once you look in his head and you start judging, I can't believe this guy believes these things, right? You lose the thread, right? We can't be judging. We can judge afterwards if we want, but it's very important to be accurate exactly what he is saying, right? What this guy is thinking, right? So that's political science. Politics is to say what he's thinking. Political science is to really try to get at the truth, what this shooter was thinking. And politics would say, you know what he was thinking? He wants to kill all the Jews. What I am claiming, which sounds crazy, is that that Goldhagen won the argument about what the 101 shooters were thinking. Those people, and I use Jeffrey Goldberg as my big example, he is the most influential person about what, quote, the evil people are thinking. That is this new type of journalism. And if you look at very influential journalists, that is what they're doing. They're telling us what these people are thinking, right? We want to know what the Hamas people were thinking. If we want to know what happened, right? To really understand, we'd interview every one of these people who came over the fence, every one of these people who shot them, and we'd start talking to them. Okay? And we'd say, hey, why do you hate the Jews? Do you hate the Jews because what do you think the Quran says about the Jews? Oh, you had a cousin who was killed last week? Oh, whatever it is, you'd interview everyone, and then we would come up with a report, and we'd say, okay, we've interviewed 1,200 people, and this is our analysis, right? Overall, they did it for this reason. So now this fight of what these people were thinking is the fight that's going on in the world. Because a lot of people, they're saying, yeah, they might have hated. The event is understandable, right? Whatever they did, it's not out of this world. Of course, we can't imagine it, right? It's the most horrible thing any human would see in their life, right? What they're seeing, right? But we have to understand the truth. We have to go beyond that. We have to think, we'd have to interview every one of these people. So now what I call never again journalists, that's their job in the culture. This is what Jeffrey Goldberg did, right? Today, that Yair Rosenberg came out with an article about Hamas. What does the behavior mean? He, who doesn't know anything about Hamas, he's writing the articles at The Atlantic. He is making the culture of what we saw, what Hamas is about, why they killed all those Israelis in the way they did, right? But my argument is these people doing what they're doing is what led to where we are today. And
Can I interject a couple questions here? When you talk about your idea of Hasbara culture, how much does the level of religiosity play into that? Is a person's level of religiousness in Judaism related to how does that factor in?
Yeah, excellent
as you see it?
question. And this is so. Take where I come from. I grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn. Right now, Netanyahu had great influence on what I'm about to tell you. But when I grew up, the Orthodox Jews, right, not the religious Zionist Jews who live in the settlements, right. These people are not hardly they're hardly Zionists. Yeah, they like Israel. They're in favor of Israel. They don't think about Israel. They're basically against the idea of Zionism because according to the Orthodox religion, you're not allowed to create your own state. You have to wait for the Messiah to come. So all the Zionists was the enemies of these people. They blamed World War II. These religious Jews, the leaders, they blamed World War II on the Zionists because of trying to go against God, creating a state. But then this idea became in Zionism, religious Zionism, by Rabbi Kook and his son. It infused nationalism, right, into this whole question and religion. And so they are very, very different from just Orthodox normal people who study or grow up studying the Talmud and things like that. But what Netanyahu has done, and even these parties, the religious parties, the non-religious Zionism parties, but just the ultra-Orthodox parties, they even were supportive of Rabin. They supported Rabin in the peace process from the outside, but still, they were, when Rabin tried to make peace, the Oslo Accords, these people were on his side.
A small note here. If you'd like to learn more about Rabin and the almost successful attempt to create a peace compromise in the 90s, a great documentary on that is the Oslo Diaries. It's a very touching and sad documentary. That's also great if you're interested in conflict resolution in general. Back to the talk.
But what Netanyahu has done is turned all these people into thinking like the religious man. He all these things I'm telling you. He's told these people that this is the Holocaust all over again. The whole world wants to kill the Jews. And he whispered once to a rabbi. He was caught whispering. Said the left forgot what it means to be Jewish. All my opponents forgot what it means to be Jewish. They forgot. They believe you can trust the Arabs, to make peace with them, basically is what he said. So these people, the non-Jews, what makes these Jews bad Jews or not good Jews? They don't realize that everyone wants to kill us, right? They're making excuses. That's what Netanyahu did. So he's every time there's a terrorist incident, he would just really poison. Netanyahu has poisoned the Jewish people, right, with his ideas. So now all the people that used to be either apolitical, now they view the world in this. They hate the Arabs. They didn't hate the Arabs, really, the Orthodox. Now they hate the Arabs as much as the religious Zionists who are like killing Palestinians. Some of them are killing Palestinians in the West Bank as we speak, right, for revenge about what happened. So
yeah, we could see that as tied into the fundamental nature of conflict, because polarization / conflict involves more and more boundary policing of saying who's really part of our group and who's not, so that leads to language like you're not really a conservative, you're not really a progressive, you're not really Jewish, these kinds of language, that basically the boundary policing there.
So understand that when Barry Weiss says that this person is thinking about the Jews, right? You have to understand when people read it and what she's saying. She's saying what this person is thinking. Now imagine that everyone believes that this is what this person is thinking, right? So Barry Weiss is the one, she's the expert on what these, quote, anti-Israel people are really thinking. Look what Israel's doing, right? The whole world is watching Al Jazeera all day of, all these innocent people being killed. Israel and announcing, Israel saying they're not human, basically, right? They said that in every which way, right? And now that's what the world is seeing. But according to Barry Weiss and Jeffrey Goldberg, no, they see the Jewish state. This is what we're dealing with in the real world. And just to give you another example of my point, Ayelet Waldman, who was an Israeli-American author, in 2006 wrote this tweet: "Yesterday's bus bombing is a tragedy, but not a surprise. This kind of terrible violence is an inevitable result of a brutal occupation." So Goldberg responded to this tweet this way: "The Jews had it coming, apparently." What she's saying is, if you do this no people have ever been oppressed the way we're oppressing the Palestinians that didn't strike back, right? We should expect to get terrorism, is what she's saying. And Goldberg's reacting, no, what are you saying? You're saying Jews are causing terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, it reminds me of sometimes the debate around trying to, when people try to give advice to women to not be attacked, to not be sexually assaulted or physically assaulted. Some of that will sometimes be interpreted as victim blaming, because you're saying, how dare you try to say that something we did contributed to us being attacked, whereas what people are trying to do there usually is trying to give people advice for how to avoid dangerous situations, but there can be a way to filter that, whereas it's victim blaming, especially if it's not done in a persuasive or respectful manner. But that just reminded me of that, where there's the act of trying to examine the role in a conflict and examine the dynamics of a conflict is interpreted as victim blaming.
Right. So what is the argument there? Like, I'm going to say this, but you'll see where the problem is. The argument there is if these social scientists interviewed the guy who attacked the woman, who raped the woman, right? And imagine you interview 1,000 of them, and 740 said that, you know what, the way she dressed turned them on, right? Imagine this happened in the real world. People say, you know what? Okay, you want to be careful? Don't dress like that turn men on, right? We can't face a question like that, right?
It's an easily offensive question to ask. What can we do better, especially when we're very angry and scared? I think that's what all these conflicts get down to, is like when people's emotions are high, it's the most offensive thing in the world to ask, what can we do better? Because we're at the peak of our heartbreak and suffering and all these emotions, and to be asked what can we do,
right,
is the height of, it feels horrible. It feels a persecution, which is understandable, when and I can see how so many people for so many conflicts don't want to self-examine, don't want to ask, what can we do better?
So let me give you what do experts say about, quote, anti-Semitism. So I'm quoting you I forgot his first name. His name is Engel. He does not use the word anti-Semitism anymore. He wrote this: is there really a connection between things like Christian hostility towards Jews in ancient times, the expulsion of Jews and denial of their rights, blood libels against Jews in medieval times, boycotts of Jewish businesses in the modern age, propagation of the belief that Jews have undue influence on the world economy, restricting Jewish immigration, the murder of Jews by the Nazis and the collaborators during the Holocaust, vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, and calls for boycott of Israel and denying Israel's right to exist? Right? He's giving you 12 examples of what we tell that's anti-Semitic, and he's saying, do any of these things have anything in common? Right? Because this is the scientific approach. We have to know what each one of these, quote, anti-Semites are thinking, right? If we really know what this is about, we'd interview every one of these anti-Semites going back in time, and we'd come back with a conclusion, right? So he's saying, if we were to do that with all these different people, we would find different things going on. So this is the scholars. That's how they look at anti-Semitism. Of course, there are things about Jews that people say over different periods of time. You understand the points I'm making, and if I disagree with something, fine, I'm wrong in some nuance, right? But this is the basic idea, of what's happening. It's all different. Whereas Hasbara culture says this one ahistorical anti-Semitism, now which is the eliminationist one, and they see it. And now after this event, and Hamas showed, Hamas, Elor Azariah is really proud now. Hamas showed, they're saying Hasbara culture is right. That's what's so interesting. Hasbara culture is, won because look what Hamas did. It's the Jew. It really is the Jews. No one behaves like this. That's why they're cutting off the heads of the babies.
A quick note here: there's been a lot of talk about beheading babies, but apparently that isn't a true story, or at least hasn't been confirmed. I'd recommend a piece by Musa Al-Gharbi where he examines the uncertainties around many of the claims being made about what happened, including reports of babies being beheaded and women being raped. That piece is titled, "If Truth Matters in the Conflict Between Israel and Gaza, Now's the Time to Tell It." I have a link to that on the blog post for this episode on my site. Back to the talk.
It's very important, the idea that these people are not the same people who fight, oppression anywhere, fight colonization. No, we're dealing with evil. This is the genocidal language is because of this idea that we're dealing not only with these killers, with the Palestinians. This is who we are with the Nazis, right? Now, politicians, we're dealing with the Nazis. So this is a victory by what Hamas doing this. Of course, there's an answer, right? If we were to interview everyone, then we'd find out the truth, right? They quote the protocols and the elders of Zion in their first platform. They then changed it. They then said no. Now, what does that mean? If you were to ask the people who wrote that platform, they'll say, yeah, we're fighting the Jews, and this is what they say about the Jews. Yeah, maybe it's true. That's in the real world. Or they might say, yeah, the Quran says we should kill the Jews, some of them say, right? But so the goal of the quote pro-Israel, not the real pro-Israel, but Hasbara culture is to say we are not dealing with events that are part of this world. This is not a normal story that you think you're seeing. Netanyahu gave a speech to Congress against the Iran deal. And during that speech in 2015, Jeffrey Goldberg tweeted this: Bibi is right. Jews should not be passive in the face of threats to annihilate us. This idea, Jews should not be passive in the face of threats to annihilate us, which, I write about the Jeffrey Goldberg and Netanyahu, it's the same idea, right? Is what's happening. Right? Is why Israel can't. It's why all these countries are just loving Israel to death, because they know, and they're talking about the Holocaust, because they understand what they're dealing with there. I'm talking about not everybody, right? I'm talking about this idea. I'm talking about ideas. The people who accept this idea, right? They can't be stopped. If they could use a nuclear weapon, they're going to use a nuclear weapon. They were embarrassed. Think about how volatile it is, what they experienced. So what I want the listener to understand, I've written how these ideas that I'm talking about influence the world. For instance, Jeffrey Goldberg, during the 2015, Obama did this Iran deal, which is very controversial, right? So Jeffrey Goldberg had an article, and he said why Iran's anti-Semitism matters. So he said, you're making a deal with Iran, whatever, they're not going to set whatever the deal is. So Goldberg confronted Obama, and actually confronted in person. And he said, I want you to answer me something. He started the article, said, I gave them what I thought a gotcha question. And he said, do you think that Iran wants to eliminate Israel? This is what he asked them. And he said, that's a gotcha question. Of course, Iran wants to eliminate Israel, right? How did Obama and Kerry react? And they said, well, they could be anti-Semitic, but all of our experts say no. They're very pragmatic. They want the billions for their economy. They're willing to give up any ideas of a nuclear weapon. This is what the experts are saying. And Jeffrey Goldberg said, no, you're wrong about that. And he browbeat Obama and Kerry, and this is what he said. He said, just look at Hitler, right? He said Hitler could have used the Jews for labor, for hard labor. They're fighting in this war. Why did they kill the Jews? He could have used them for hard labor. But instead he said, I'm going to sacrifice whatever help I can get from the Jews, because ideologically he had to kill them. That's what anti-Semitism is. So he accused Obama and Kerry. He said, don't you realize that Iran would commit suicide, right? If they could kill the Jews, if they could nuke Israel, they'd welcome suicide. So these ideas, I give 100 examples of things like that, where Obama, it's no protection for Obama and Kerry to say, these are what all the experts say, because Jeffrey Goldberg, just like Goldhagen was the expert of what's going on in the head of the shooter, Jeffrey Goldberg is the expert of what's going on in Khomeini's head, right? That's what these people are, the experts are, enough to go confront an Obama and Kerry and saying, don't you understand who you're dealing with? When other Jewish organizations try to take a different position, try to think of the Palestinian narrative, what happened was Jeffrey Goldberg and people like them turned them into self-hating Jews. If I could just read you, we talk about Kerchik. So in 2016, in one of the debates between Sanders and Clinton, he said Netanyahu is not always right. So he took a public position on the side of the Palestinians, which was a very big deal because once that's accepted, the floodgates will open. Once it's not whose side are you on, the Jews or their enemies, and once it becomes more complicated, then every progressive politician say, of course, I want peace. Yeah, the Palestinians have claims, right? I see their perspective, and I wrote an article how these people, how Hasbara culture, what they did to Sanders. They turned him into a self-hating Jew. Jeffrey Goldberg tweeted, I don't know why Bernie Sanders won't say is the first American Jewish president, right?
I think Yakov meant to say first American Jewish presidential candidate. Back to the top.
He constantly, that's what Goldberg did to all these people who made some criticism. He'd say, this guy doesn't realize they all want to kill us. And the reason is because they have some pathology. They have a Jewish pathology that's self-hatred. When Jeffrey Goldberg, he got, there were these skirmishes the last 25 years about all of these questions. So Greenwald took made these arguments in favor. He took the Palestinian perspective, basically. So Jeffrey Goldberg attacked him. When Jeffrey Goldberg attacked him, he had to explain why this guy Greenwald is taking the side of the Palestinians. He said probably something horrible happened to him in Hebrew school. The reason why this Jew is thinking of the perspective of the Palestinians, because he was molested when he was a kid, right? It's a pathology. And now he hates all the Jews. So anyone who tried to end this conflict, right, in Israel, any attempt of a two-state solution became impossible. Every politician the question is always, are you with the Jews or are you with the people who want to kill the Jews? Every question. That's why no one has the courage to call for a ceasefire, right? Because when you call for a ceasefire, you're saying, no, you're stopping the Jews from doing what needs to be done. After the Holocaust, that whole story, when you say ceasefire, so the State Department, they came out with a memo, nobody called for a ceasefire. No one say those words, because that's what it means when you say those words. That's the power of these ideas. And the events unfolding, if they keep on being interpreted by Barry Weiss and Jeffrey Goldberg and Yair Rosenberg and Hasbara culture and Republican politicians, that's why a Republican politician, it's so powerful to say, this charge that Biden is on the side of Hamas. You find one thing Biden did, you say, we would have done something differently, Biden's on the side of Hamas. That's the political culture we're living in, right? So,
can I ask you? I wanted to get to some questions that I'd accumulated. I interviewed James Kirchick, which was kind of like what led up to us talking, and I think one thing you both would probably agree on is that anti-Semitism is hugely overstated. I think he might find more of it. He would call more things anti-Semitic in terms of criticisms of Israel than you would, but I think you both would agree that the problem is often overstated on both sides. Is that accurate? On both political sides in the U.S., I mean.
Yes,
is that
look
accurate
what happens. So you have Republicans, let's say they put pictures of billionaires, or they use, let's go back a little time. When they use the word globalist, right? I believe that people who study, they didn't think about Jews when they're using the word globalist, right? Whatever. Suddenly, the certain influential Jews say, hey, globalist, you mean the Jews. And suddenly, what the result in the culture is anytime someone uses the word globalist, he's thinking about the Jews. If the word globalist would be allowed to live, nothing would happen to the Jews, right? Yeah, a few people would say Jews, no problem, right? That's no problem. A few people say globalist. But when you make every person who wants to use the word globalist think, the Jews say this is anti-Semitic. Should I do it or shouldn't I do it? Suddenly you have terrible strife, and this leads to anti-Semitism. These interventions cultivate anti-Semitism. So I am blaming Hasbara culture for the world we live in. As simple as that. And one last thing. I know I've been going on and on. Really important. One last thing. When you listen to me, you're like, what's my politics? I want to quote 3 quotes, Jeffrey Goldberg, Barry Weiss, and Kirchick, since this is responding to Kirchick, about Jews. This is what they wrote about Jews who were taking the perspective of the Palestinian, right? Who believe, in other words, they believe, quote, they have a case, right? When you look at the world from the Palestinian perspective, very different. So how do they explain all these writers and thinkers that they defamed over the years for trying to get a two-state solution, for seeing the Palestinian perspective? I'm going to quote first Jeffrey Goldberg. says he's talking about this group of people. The others, though, are part of a tiny minority of Jews who believe that the destruction of Israel will bring them the approval of non-Jews which they crave. This is an ideology, Go. He's not just saying, this is an ideology. Well, listen to Barry Weiss. She's talking about the same people. As many well-intentioned people look to understand why a very small but very vocal group of Jews seem as deeply opposed to Jewish interests as many of our community's enemies, these Jews ought to be understood in context as part of a long history of left-wing anti-Semitic movements that successfully conscript Jews as agents in their own destruction. And then so he wrote this article about Bernie Sanders in 2016. He says Bernie Sanders and its Jewish devotees can distance themselves from Israel and Zionism all they want. But as has always been the case, it will make no difference to the people they are trying to please, who continue to reduce them to a single factor of their identity, which in their minds has attained the totalizing force of an epithet, Jew. Okay? Kirchhoff says, you know what? All the people you're dealing with, and when these move into your leftist friends, when they look at you, they see Jew, and you don't want to accept that because you want them to like you, right? This is the level of argument by Hasbara culture.
Okay. Let me pivot there to. Do you see some of these elements in the American left-right divide around, for example, anti-racism, racism? Conflicts there? Do you see some of this?
Yes, of course. I mean, because as I'm not the first one that's saying it, when you're looking at the world, and if you're ideological, what does ideological mean? You're constantly looking for proof from the real world for what you believe, right? You can't be objective because if you believe white people are racist, right, or where you have a strong belief, you're constantly, like I'm talking about the Jewish people, if you're constantly looking for evidence of, let's say, white people being racist, right? You can have nonstop ammunition, which convinces you of your belief. And anyone who's following you, who's following your thinking, right? Who's reading you, right? They're doing the same thing, right? There's not someone in there saying, hold on, think about the other side. Think about what the argument is against. For instance, when Trump ran in 2016, I knew we were in big trouble because at MSNBC, some opinion person said, these people voted for Trump because they're racist. And it turned out, I saw that big percentage of these people had voted for Obama.
Yeah, there's a great, actually, one of the most important articles that I only recently learned about. I think it's one of the most important articles. Is this great paper called "Race and the Race for the White House" by Musa Al-Gharbi, and it really delves into some of the really bad research that purported to find large amounts of racism amongst Trump voters. And it really highlighted, and it's something I talk about in my Diffusing American Anger book, just how much people were filtering for what they wanted to find, basically. And I think it gets to the fundamental nature of extreme conflict, where so many people are filtering for these extremely pessimistic and sky is falling narratives. And I mean, to take one example, I mean, we could take many examples, but on the American right, I see these, really elaborate narratives they built up about the evil Marxist plots around them and how everything is tied to Marxism. And there's this undercurrent of Marxism, right? Whereas, like, I think the thing that's missing from this is, like, yes, some of these ideas do have a history of related to, very far left ideas and such, and you can build that narrative. But it's also just true that we're living in a world, any complex human world involves a cascade of ideas, and you can build all these complex narratives of all sorts that to bolster your, most pessimistic views of what's happening. Whereas in reality, it's much more banal than that. Like, people are responding to they're humans responding to the things around them, which include,
this is the these people are human. Yeah, they're not ideas. They're not. Yeah, they're human beings. Exactly. They're not some idea.
And part of what they're responding to is the things that they see as threats on the other side. So, it gets back to this idea of, in a conflict, we can be helping create the very things that we are most afraid of by how we react to them. Because, for example, like when Republicans say really horrible things about far left people or transgender people or whoever it is, they're helping create the animosity that makes people on the left feel that they're under attack, which strengthens their passion, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the thing that people try to do in a conflict is build these narratives that leave themselves out of it, right? They build these narratives of, look at these horrible things that these people have done, and they build this narrative that suits their us versus them emotions, but they're leaving themselves out of the equation, right? And this isn't to say that both sides are equal, both sides are the same in any conflict, because that's often the objection people get. I think the point is that if we're interested in resolving conflicts, we have to be willing to examine our role in the conflict, whether we think the other side is worse, even much worse. The first step is thinking about our role in the conflict and being willing to self-examine and not see criticism of us as a mortal threat or something, as a horrible insult. So
Yeah. If we could have cognitive empathy for both the Jewish dead, think about the hostages. Think about what it must be like.
It's terrifying. I mean, it's unthinkable.
Right? And at the same time, think about these people in Gaza. When you think about it, human beings, the death that have nothing to do with anything, right? But they're thought of as an idea, not human beings. Israel, right? Not all Israel are saying this is an idea. These are the Nazis. They supported the Nazis, and we're allowed to kill the Nazis. That's the idea. They're not thinking of these people as actual human beings, like we think of the people, that Hamas killed. We know, we can relate to, we could have cognitive empathy, see the world, what they experience while this is happening. We can't even think about what that's like, right? So we have to be able to do that. Each side has to be able to do that for the other side, or God knows where this is going.
And right? One thing, something what you said have been saying, made me think of was the Jonestown massacre. I recently watched this documentary. It just made me think that the horrible things that these people did. When Jim Jones, had them drink the poisoned Kool-Aid, and some of the parents even got their kids to drink the Kool-Aid, their own children and their own spouses and et cetera. There's a narrative you could build about how evil these people were. You could build a very pessimistic narrative of that these people must have been horrible. Their ideology must have been so out of whack, like inhuman, because look, how could you do these things? It's unthinkable. But the more banal explanation, getting back to the banality of evil, is just that people are very weak, and they're very led by the people around them, and they are very, very easily succumb to peer pressure in surprising ways that just are really hard to fathom. Like, it's almost easier to imagine people are evil in some of these situations than to imagine that how could you do that just based because the people around you were doing it and you were afraid to push back. But I mean, that I think it really does get to this human frailty, this human weakness of how weak we really are in many cases, and that's hard to understand too, because I think most of us had this idea of the strength of ourselves. We're self-sufficient. We have agency.
Never do that.
We would never do these kinds of things. But I think it does get to this fundamental human question of the human element of that we are all products of the people and ideas around us, and in the right circumstances, we are capable of all sorts of things that we wouldn't think we'd be capable of. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the fundamental human dilemma there that is hard to solve, that we just find these things so hard to understand. That was a talk with Yakov Hirsch. You can find his writings on Mondoweiss, and you can follow him on Twitter at Yakov Hirsch. This has been the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. You can learn more about it and sign up for a premium subscription at peoplewhoreadpeople.com. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, you might also want to sign up for my Depolarization to AIM Substack newsletter, which is called Diffusing American Anger. Thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.